Forgot about the phone.
It's super nice. I love these last two presentations. So this is like decline. Like you had a drink, it was good. You had IKEA, I mean, magic. And then it was not so different, Russia. No, not so different. From IKEA to Moscow, it was this very slight shift, but now really it goes now downhill. But if I take it really, really low, then you can have another drink. You will need another drink. So my mission to lower the quality so you can have a happy ending. Okay. The Bauhaus was killed by this man. Be careful of this man. This is a very dangerous person. You can see he's very good with squirting water. He's good with horses. Super good with ping pong. He can jump. He shaves like no one else. Or so Life magazine thought. He's good with women. He's good with women. He's good with women. He's good with women. Yeah. Not just one. But he's really, really the best with management. And by the way, this, all of this might be management. After all, how was it possible for me to show you these pictures? Like, how was it managed that this was constructed, okay? This guy. But be careful. So, management. There were two accomplices to the murder, Herbert Bayer, here in Aspen, accidentally turning for the camera that was accidentally on the top of a mountain. Moholy-Nagy, decapitated by a sculptor in Chicago, hiding, defending, or some kind of weapon aimed at you. Very little art is not a weapon, or very little art that's worth talking about, let's say, is not a weapon. This is surely a weapon. They killed the Bauhaus by turning it into an image. They're experts in images, specifically Herbert Bayer and Moholy-Nagy. You can't really discuss a 20th century image without those two creatures. And they did it in very specific places, 1923, the catalogue, and the book series that came out. By the way, if you look at the Bauhaus book series, there's very little Bauhaus in it. That's my point, I suppose. 1930 Paris, beautifully described by Philipp, as a kind of premature requiem. 1938 MoMA. 1968 Stuttgart, not done by them, but approved by them, and a very interesting occasion. 68, in every way, remains interesting. What were they doing in these situations? They were turning the Bauhaus into a product. Right? So the place, we identify with a certain kind of attitude about the product. The place itself was a product. And in fact, the product that is the Bauhaus is much more important than the products produced there. They domesticated it. By the way, we're never sure what happened at the Bauhaus. We don't need to be sure, because if it has become a product, if it has become a kind of an image, it doesn't really matter what the image is of. What matters is the image itself. The image itself has more force, you could say more lethal force than the institution itself. We never exactly know what happened at the Bauhaus. We don't know. After the birthday party of 100 years, all of the scholars digging in the archives, those archives that remain open, have managed to pull up more and more and more and more information. But do we have the feeling that we know the Bauhaus better? Or do you have the feeling that you simply don't know? Of course, there were performances, there were exhibitions, there were publications, and we now know much more about the performances, the exhibitions, the parties, and the publications. But that's what they always wanted us to know. Actually, the performances, the exhibitions, the parties, and the publications, that is exactly what they wanted us to know. Those are the communication efforts of the Bauhaus. We know much more about that. What we don't know is what it is that was being communicated. You could even say the performances, the exhibitions, the parties, and the publications were themselves constructed not so much as an image, but as a kind of distraction. Like, oh, that's what the Bauhaus is, or it's that place in which those things happen. If it was a laboratory, I think it was a laboratory. I think it would be important to say that neither we, after this 100 years of scholarship, you could even say, not just celebration, but scholarship, nor the people in it knew what was going on. In other words, we shouldn't assume that the people inside the Bauhaus, if there was an inside of the Bauhaus, and there were people in there, because, by the way, we don't really know, right? I mean, maybe you think there were, but I'm curious what kind of evidence that you're using. If they were, by the way, the world experts, the 20th century experts in the media, why do you assume that those images somehow convey to you the truth of the Bauhaus? Why do you imagine that there was such a thing? Would you even be interested in the question, was there anything happening at the Bauhaus, if you hadn't encountered those images? Right? So you receive enormously seductive images that would tell you about something called the Bauhaus and make you curious about something about the Bauhaus and give you a sense of the reality of the Bauhaus, but you yourself yet don't know if there was such a thing. And you have every reason not to trust the people that gave you the images. But even if there was such a thing as the Bauhaus, and there were people, let's say, inside the Bauhaus, would we assume that they knew what was going on? Do you know what's going on this evening? Like, what kind of mistake did you make when you decided to spend an evening at a requiem for the Bauhaus? What did you think you were going to? I can tell you, as one of the people on the inside of this, we have no idea. Right? So what makes you imagine that anybody on the inside of anything ever knows what they are doing? Isn't the idea that you know what you're doing, what anybody knows what they're doing, something that comes afterwards? Like your own life, for example. Do you look in the mirror in the morning and say, that's me? Right? Or is it that you sort of somehow deal with the weirdness of that and look for some sort of opportunities to construct the sense that you are that person, and maybe you turn to your friends for a kind of mirror that says, yes, you exist, you're there, right? So why would we imagine the Bauhaus was different? Why would you imagine that the Bauhaus people knew what the Bauhaus was and they had a kind of Bauhaus experience? Couldn't you just assume that they had no fucking idea what was going on, right? And elaborated a whole series of representations that made it possible for other people to imagine that they knew what was going on. Like any architect, for example, presenting a project where you say you know exactly what it is that you're going to say. And by the way, the client pretends that they ask you to produce that thing. But no architect that's at all interesting would give a client what the client asked for. The brilliant architect, she's the one that gives the client what the client didn't ask for, but then thinks that they should have asked for and even pretends that they did ask for it, right? So why wouldn't we think that the Bauhaus was the same? That is to say, nobody there knew what was going on. They're all like, but thank God for media, because we were able to produce this extraordinary image of what was going on. So, okay, imagine that there is this laboratory in which there are people who have no idea at all what's going on, but a massively successful publicity campaign is generated to give them some kind of sense of identity. My point here is that, in fact, the Bauhaus was super opaque. It's the very model of the opaque. This is the model of the model, by the way. This is the model of the Bauhaus. And you see, it's not a kind of glassy, Miesian thing. It's a solid, right? And you might say, oh yeah, but that's just the model, they had to make it. Okay, but then when they drew it, it's a solid. It's radiating all of this magical glow, like whatever this thing is that you don't know what it is. It's kind of a religious object, right? It's got this aura, and this is by one of the unknown partners, of course, of Gropius, not even Maya. This is the partner behind the partner. And there it is kind of glowing. Oh yeah, but then when they actually make it, because it's made of glass, and it's a big glass box, right? So surely when it's made, we'll have this big glass box, and it's modern, and it's a factory, and we can see in there, we've got no secrets, right, because it's modern. There's the big glass box in the famous photographs of Lucia Moholy-Nagy, stolen by Walter Gropius, famously. You don't see anything. You never see anything. It is like this huge seduction, because you're told, like, here we'll show you everything. It's all glass, and you look, and you see nothing. You might think, oh, it's just this particular photograph. No, it's every photograph. Right? It's the whole point of the photographs. By the way, these are not just photographs. This is the Bauhaus. This is like one of the epicenters of the kind of definition of 20th century photography. And these images, of all the images you could choose, are these ones. This is no accident that you can't see in again and again. You can never see in. That's the whole point that you don't see in. In fact, what you do is sort of disappear into the glass. Right? So the glass itself, even looking, like into a corner, all you see in a way is sort of some sort of vague reflection. So there you've got this sort of super mythical place, which is a big glass box, like, hey, we've got no secrets. and it's all secrets, of course your desire is now mobilized. Now you're very interested in fantasizing what's going on. Now this fact that we don't really know what was going on in the Bauhaus, I don't want this to seem like sort of super romantic or some sort of Masonic secret that there was like weird stuff or going on there. I do want to point out that it's extremely interesting that you have no idea what happens in the Bauhaus. We have very few images of the workshop, so all those images are coming up, but you still don't get a feeling for what constitutes workshop life. This is extremely important given that there are so many photographers there. Like almost everybody that's supposed to be in the building is a photographer. And this is the very scene of photography. In other words, this is a sort of uber site of photography, and that uber site is a space in which you don't know where that photographs are being produced. But sorry to bore you with some thoughts about this, right? Like, photographs taken in the Bauhaus would not be the same as photographs of the Bauhaus. In other words, we could look at every photograph ever taken, every negative. That wouldn't necessarily communicate anything about the space in which those photographs were taken. Even if you consider them to be, as it were, Bauhaus photographs. Like, here's a photograph taken by somebody in the Bauhaus, and it's got all the characteristics of a Bauhaus photograph. That still doesn't give you, as it were, sort of insight into what constitutes the Bauhaus, other than the image itself or the collection of images. In fact, you could even argue the opposite, that a kind of a huge amount of documentary evidence of what might be going on inside of the Bauhaus wouldn't precisely not be evidence of what's going on in the Bauhaus, but a kind of cover-up, a kind of surface. I don't mean this in the sort of romantic sense, like, oh, there's a great secret to the Bauhaus and a great kind of conspiracy. I think it's the conspiracy of all schools. I think that's exactly what's interesting about all schools. Or to put it, let's say, more arrogantly, what is most important in any school is precisely what doesn't come out, right? What could never come out, which is not quite representable by the school. I'm not speaking here about some sort of pre-media truth, like there is a sort of inner essence when people are together inside a school and there's just no form of media representation that can capture this magic thing. You have to have been there, man, right? Sort of like the 60s. If you could remember it, you weren't there. If you were there, you don't remember it. It's kind of a situation like this. This thing that can't come out of a school, this thing that cannot be represented by the school, is not a pre-media truth. It's quite the opposite. It's a kind of in and of the media. After all, a school is a media technology. A school is a system of reproduction, right? It's exactly about a certain kind of mechanical kind of realigning of human capacity in a particular direction, in a particular reproductive direction. And if that's true, if a school is a media system, a media technology, it by definition can't communicate what it is that makes that media possible. That is exactly what a media cannot communicate is the thing that makes that media generated. So when I'm saying we don't know the inside of the Bauhaus, this is not kind of unique to the Bauhaus, but it's kind of an interesting case. But if those of you who have taken care of a school know that that which you take care of is not the precise teachers that you put in place or the precise courses or the precise publication, but something that cannot be, as it were, spoken about or is in a certain sense unspeakable. It's not necessarily scandalous. It can be a kind of hesitation, it can be a silence, and it's certainly not singular. But if you're curating a school, you're creating the capacity to create conditions that are not yet, as it were, representable, but if so, would constitute a new form of representation and a transformation in the history of technology and media and education. In other words, if your school is a laboratory for some kind of experiment, by definition, what it nurtures, what it cares about is precisely that which can't come out, that might eventually come out. And just have that all in the back of your mind. This would suggest that this is not a monster. I would love this to be a monster. You know, I just, for a million reasons, just starting with gender and ending with the bow tie. These are all, the bow tie alone is a kind of criminal act. By the way, 2 of Walter Gropius's bow ties are in the archives in Harvard, if you wish to see them. So treasured they are, so monumentally important they are. For a very long time, one of the signs that you had been a student at Harvard was that you wore a bow tie. Right? It was a kind of a sort of demonstration of your architectural expertise. But this, I think, is actually not a monster, quite the opposite. This is such a political creature. Right? If you know anything about the history of Gropius, he's as political as you could possibly get, which means that he is not a kind of a monster carrying out a particular crime. On the contrary, he's quite a sensitive kind of respondent to historical forces. He's kind of, you can see it in his body if you look at it. He's just buffeted by the left and the right at all times. You could say he was the kind of midwife giving birth to a kind of singular, super hyper-visible Bauhaus, kind of, as it were, extracted from the corpse of the Bauhaus like some kind of unknown soldier. Sorry for all of that. But it's something like there is this Bauhaus thing which is killed kind of collaboratively, like in an Agatha Christie story. Gropius is just one of the many people with knives, but plucked out of his corpse is the Bauhaus that we know today. So I'm inviting you to sort of look at this face, just rippling with all the forces of history moving. And this is the king, or I should say queen of appeasement. Right? This is the person who's so sensitively responding to the heavy-duty right criticism of the Bauhaus even before it was open. So strongly does he resist that some of his resistance gets internalized and shapes the inside, the self-repressive inside of the Bauhaus. So it's precisely, in a certain sense, if I was saying before that the glass of the Bauhaus shows you nothing of the inside, this is certainly not true of Walter Gropius's face. Everything ripples there very, very clearly, which means that we're right in the middle of the Night of the Living Dead, 1968, the beginning of the zombie movie. I guess it's the answer to the question, alive or dead, yes or no, right? The same. But here we are, kind of drifting in this kind of Bauhaus world. A funeral for the Bauhaus, a funeral for a zombie, not an easy thing, by the way. Funeral for a Bauhaus. I definitely don't recommend leaning over the coffin. Keep a certain distance. Don't kiss the corpse. Whatever you do. By the way, anybody standing beside you at the funeral, like in this room, you're not safe. You don't know who's been infected. You really don't. The ghost of the Bauhaus, let's just take this room. Some of you are victims of art, architecture, and design schools, probably a significant amount. There is no such thing as an art, architectural design school that hasn't been infected with the Bauhaus virus. It's right there, very, very clearly in the pedagogical and the techniques and the structures, the very definitions of what constitutes a school. So anybody in the room that has had that kind of experience, you're not safe for the others. Highly contagious in spaces like this. But it's not just those of you who have encountered art and architecture schools, it's also in the way we frame politics. There is no politician today that doesn't frame their political campaign in terms of very, very clear strategies of communication and kind of general sort of attitudes to what constitutes a society that were indoctrinated in the Bauhaus. It's in the way we communicate. In the same sense that when you open your mouth, your parents come out regardless of your attitudes to them. The same with the Bauhaus. No matter what we're going to say at this party, you open your mouth, Bauhaus. It's pouring out. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to be the one to criticize it? With what words are you going to use? Bauhaus words? Like, it's not so easy. So that's your problem, right? It's a virus. It's super alive. Everybody in this room. And it's, anyway, you're not really people in this room. You're cell phones with people carrying them around. Right? Your cell phone is a much more precise record of you in your love life, in your economic life, in your aspirations and your ambitions. A cell phone knows things about you that you don't know yet. In fact, your whole point of life is to catch up with your cell phone. Right? Your cell phone is sort of like sitting there saying, like, you know, you could be more like you than you are right now. And this is the sort of, so basically you are kind of, I mean, this is like a zombie movie of the greatest. By the way, those cell phones are operated by, imagine that you would write a science fiction novel that says that a teenager owns a company which is the biggest monopoly in the world, and almost every citizen of the earth has signed a contract saying every communication they make with that device is the private property of that teenager in the name of democracy. Right? Just imagine, if you write such a science fiction, it would not be accepted anywhere. But it's actually, of course, what we live in today, right? So in this sense, it's not even a zombie movie, because even in the zombie movie, you sort of think like, well, there are those things, if only I could kill them. It's not even the things. We are just sort of like a husk. for the phone. And the phone is pure Bauhaus. Smooth, constrained. You don't want to know what's inside it. Right? In the same way you don't want to know what's inside your body or inside your mother or father's head, or even your own head. Imagine the horror it would be that all of us would suddenly right now know everything that's going on. You don't want to know. It's not accidentally a Bauhaus object. Steve Jobs visits the Aspen campus designed by Herbert Bayer in 1981, returns in 1983 to make this famous speech, "The future is not what it used to be," and describes the future of computers as a Bauhaus project. Right? It's a very, very explicitly Bauhaus project. So just to try to give you some hope after all this doom and gloom, as some of you know, I'm kind of obsessed with the fact that there was no Bauhaus, or let's say the Bauhaus was not inside the school, but outside the school. There may have been another school on the inside, but the real Bauhaus was the Bauhaus made by the students and who became our teachers. We look at the students playing on the outside of the building. We hardly ever see the inside of the building. And they're kind of trapped in this facade, this non-transparent facade. There they are, a sort of male, female. There's certain gender things going on. But there's also kind of a blurring between the student and the facade. Even their self-representation is kind of as the facade. And very specifically the balconies, those parts of the building that kind of stick out. You would think that's not so important. It's just the students' areas, right? And it's just the balconies of the students' areas. But these are kind of like medical problems, like kind of leaping out, trying to escape. And in fact, you can do a history of the reception of this building, and it has everything to do with those balconies and nothing to do with the glass on the outside. So in other words, the darkness of the glass on the front is matched by the kind of display space on the back. There's just thousands of them. Just let you sort of swim in them. You know them already. And of course, they're like eagerly trying to be Bauhaus students. But it occurs to me that they're also trying to escape. Especially after hearing Beatriz's lecture. You feel like they're on the way out, like look at them, this is kind of a desperation. Now, of course, I see this as the great zombie movie. Right, so I mean, just to sort of finish, I go from like wanting to assassinate many, many times Walter Gropius. And I still think it's a good thing to do. Can't be killed enough. But these students seem to me have already caught this sort of virus. They're sort of saying like, hey, we're Bauhaus students. And they're not just the students and the teachers, and the photographs are also by the students there. So they're sort of desperate to him. The whole of Bauhaus is performed on the facade. They are like the ornament of the building. They are the building. They are the representation of the Bauhaus. They are everything about the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is sort of a surface, a kind of media surface on which is performed this kind of act. And we stand there as the witnesses. Behind them is this mythical space. And I think they're, in this kind of mode. So I generally feel like, and maybe it's a little bit resonating with what Philipp was saying, the kind of killing of the Bauhaus was a kind of very, very early act and a kind of multiple act, because why would we assume that there was ever just one Bauhaus? I mean, I think the great violence of the Gropius, Herbert Bayer, Moholy-Nagy advertising strategy was the idea that there was only one Bauhaus, linked, of course, to Gropius and all of that. It's the killing off of the idea that there were multiple Bauhauses and multiple possible Bauhauses, or Bauhauses inside the Bauhaus that were not considered to be truly Bauhaus, but nobody quite knew why. And in fact, that's what the school was trying to figure out, what constitutes a legitimate Bauhaus versus one that is not. So what we receive is this sort of super, super edited image. And this editing, I would suggest, is already happening in the hands of the students, and we could go into that in more detail. So I'm just leaving you with that kind of light thought. With zombies, as a rule, you got to get the brain. You got to chop the head off. That's very effective. But even then, much better to really destroy the brain. And this is where I think scholars come in. I think it's kind of crucial to get to the brain of the Bauhaus and really work on the specific concepts that were put in place. Those concepts are lethal. They are the mechanisms of sustaining systems of structural inequality throughout the world. They are absolutely powerful devices like the iPhone for maintaining borders, limits, lines, borders. They're not accidentally linked to the national populisms that we see these days. And so it seems to me there is a somewhat urgent task to sort of drill into the brain of the Bauhaus and really extract the conceptual work that was going on there, and also challenge ourselves, because I think that we still have a kind of a romance about the Bauhaus, a kind of romance about the good old days when schools were schools and all of that. And the Bauhaus, as Marion has demonstrated so brilliantly, was never just in one place anyway. It was a kind of really viral phenomenon from the beginning. That would imply some kind of collaborative research, some kind of serious work. I think we could watch a lot of zombie films to get some sort of tricks as to how that would work. I don't know, would be good. Thanks.